The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft, golden streaks across the room. Liam hadn't slept, but he didn't mind. Ava had fallen asleep in his arms on the couch, her breathing steady now, her face finally at peace after what seemed like months of torment. He watched her for a moment, gently running his fingers through her hair, marveling at how fragile and strong she looked all at once. His heart ached, but it also swelled with something new. Hope. As the sunlight crept further into the room, Ava stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She blinked a few times before her gaze found his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She just looked at him, as if trying to confirm that he was really there and that last night hadn't been a dream. "Morning," Liam said softly, offering her a small smile. Ava sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders as she rubbed her eyes. "You stayed." "I told you I would," he replied, reaching for her hand. "And I meant it." She smiled faintly, but he could see the hesitation lurking behind her eyes, the fear that the comfort of last night was temporary, that reality would eventually come crashing down on them again. Liam squeezed her hand, silently promising her that this time he wouldn't let that happen. "I don't want to be a burden," Ava whispered, her voice fragile but sincere. "You're not," he said firmly, leaning closer until their foreheads nearly touched. "Ava, you're the person I want to fight for. You always have been." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was the kind of tear that came from relief, the kind that washed away months of bottled-up emotions. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. Eventually, Ava pulled back slightly and gave him a bittersweet smile. "I thought you hated me after I left." "I never hated you," Liam said, shaking his head. "I was hurt, I was confused, but deep down I could never hate you. I think I was just scared." She frowned softly. "Scared of what?" "Scared that I had already lost you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when I signed those papers, it felt like I was giving up. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. Even when I was angry, you were still the first thing on my mind every morning, and the last thing before I fell asleep." Ava's lips trembled as she wiped her eyes. "I thought walking away was the only way to save us from more pain. I didn't realize I was causing the very pain I was trying to avoid." Liam cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the lingering tears. "We're done running, Ava. No more hiding things from each other. No more assuming we know what the other person needs. We talk. We fight if we have to. But we stay." She nodded, her breathing shaky but steadying as she processed his words. "You really mean it, don't you?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "You don't get to push me away again, no matter how hard things get. I'm stubborn, remember." She laughed softly, the sound a mix of joy and disbelief, as though she was slowly allowing herself to trust him again. "Yeah, you are." He smiled and kissed her forehead, lingering there as he closed his eyes, silently vowing to be the man she needed him to be. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. They weren't perfect, and they had a long road ahead of them, but they weren't broken beyond repair. They had both made mistakes, but they could fix them, together. As the morning light bathed the room, Ava leaned into him again, and Liam held her as if he were holding their future in his arms. The boxes near the walls no longer felt like symbols of an ending, but rather the beginning of something new. The thought of her packing up and leaving wasn't terrifying anymore because he knew one thing for certain. This time, she wasn't going anywhere without him. And for once, that was enough. The room was still, but Liam could feel the tremor in Ava's breathing as she clung to him, as if afraid that if she let go, he might disappear. He gently guided her inside and closed the door behind them. The apartment was dimly lit, with only a small lamp glowing from the corner of the room. Boxes were stacked near the walls, half packed, as if she had been preparing to leave again. The sight made his heart ache, but he pushed the thought aside. She wasn't leaving. Not this time. They sat down on the couch, their fingers intertwined, neither of them ready to let go. Liam didn't want to rush her, but the questions weighed on him like a lead weight pressing into his chest. He watched as Ava wiped her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled slightly, and he gently placed his palm over them, offering silent reassurance. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were glassy but determined. "I wasn't trying to shut you out," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing. When the doctor told me it was serious, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want you to feel trapped in a life that wasn't what you signed up for." Liam shook his head, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "I signed up for everything, Ava. The good, the bad, and the messy in between. That's what love is, isn't it? You don't get to pick and choose the easy parts." She let out a shaky breath, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I thought I was sparing you the pain, but I was only making it worse for both of us." He held her close, stroking her hair as the guilt in her voice made his chest tighten. "We both made mistakes, Ava. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I see that now. I got so wrapped up in work and everything else that I missed the signs. But you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "But what if I get worse? What if it becomes too much for you?" "Then we'll face it together," he said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "I don't care what happens. I'm here. I'm staying, no matter how hard it gets. You're not just someone I loved once. You're someone I still love. And I'm not walking away." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Liam gently wiped it away. For a moment they just sat there in the quiet, breathing in sync, as if trying to find some sense of calm in the chaos of their emotions. Then Ava shifted slightly and reached for something on the coffee table, a worn journal, the pages frayed and marked with ink stains. She handed it to him, her fingers grazing his as she did. "I've been writing everything down," she said softly. "The things I was too scared to say to you. I thought that if you ever found out, maybe this would help you understand." Liam hesitated for a moment before opening the journal. The first page was filled with neat handwriting, her words raw and honest. He read the first few lines, his throat tightening as he realized the depth of her fear and love for him. Every page was a mixture of pain, hope, and regret, but there was one thing that stood out above all. She had never stopped loving him. Tears blurred his vision as he closed the journal and pulled her into his arms again. "We're going to get through this," he whispered against her hair. "I don't care how long it takes or how hard it gets. I'm not leaving you." Ava buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled but steady. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe him. The weight she had been carrying alone finally began to lift, and as Liam held her, he silently made a vow to himself, a vow stronger than any promise he had ever made before. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. The night wore on, but neither of them moved from the couch. They didn't need to. In that small, quiet space, they had found what they thought they had lost: the courage to fight for each other again. And for the first time in months, Liam didn't feel like he was chasing something that had slipped away. Instead, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The night air was cold, biting against Liam's skin as he ran toward his car, his breath visible in the chilly darkness. His mind raced faster than his footsteps, replaying the letter's words over and over, like a haunting melody he couldn't shut off. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as he started the engine, his knuckles turning white. His heart thumped wildly, not from fear, but from desperation. How had he let things get so bad without seeing the truth? How had he not noticed that Ava was falling apart right in front of him? The drive to Ava's apartment felt like an eternity, even though he sped down familiar roads, ignoring traffic lights that turned yellow too soon and the blaring horns of irritated drivers. He couldn't afford to slow down. His mind couldn't handle the thought of her sitting alone in that apartment, waiting for a response she probably thought would never come. The guilt gnawed at him, each second passing like a punishment for every mistake he had made. He had spent so long thinking she didn't care, but the truth was, she had cared too much. When he finally pulled up outside her building, he barely remembered parking the car or shutting the door. His legs carried him forward, past the entrance and up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he reached her floor and paused in front of her door. His hand hovered over the doorbell, hesitation gripping him for a split second. What if she had changed her mind? What if she didn't want to see him anymore? He shook off the doubt and rang the bell, the sound echoing in the hallway like a distant alarm. The seconds stretched painfully, and for a moment he thought she wasn't going to answer. But then the door creaked open, and there she was, Ava. She stood there, wrapped in a loose sweater, her face pale and her eyes swollen from what he could only assume were endless tears. Her hair was messy, as though she had just gotten out of bed, but to Liam, she looked as beautiful as ever. Neither of them spoke at first. They just stood there, staring at each other as the weight of everything unsaid settled between them. Ava's fingers clutched the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles turning white, as if she were bracing herself for whatever he was about to say. But Liam couldn't find the words. His eyes burned as he fought the lump in his throat. How could he explain what he was feeling when even he didn't fully understand it? Ava's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "You got the letter?" Liam nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "I got it." Tears welled up in her eyes and she looked away, as if she couldn't bear to see the expression on his face. "I didn't expect you to come." He took a step closer, his heart breaking as he saw her wipe her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, the weight of his emotions pouring into every word. "Why did you go through this alone?" "I thought it would be easier for you if I walked away," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want you to see me like this." "But you leaving hurt more than anything else could have," Liam whispered. His hand shook as he reached for hers, gently pulling her fingers away from the doorframe and holding them between his own. "You were the only thing that mattered to me, Ava. I could have handled anything if you had just let me." A sob escaped her lips, and she collapsed into his arms, her body trembling as he held her tightly. His chin rested on the top of her head, and he closed his eyes, letting her tears soak into his shirt. He didn't care. He wanted to absorb all of her pain, to take it away and replace it with the love he should have shown her before it was too late. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "I didn't know what else to do." "You don't have to be sorry," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. I should have been there. I should have fought harder for us." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him, her tear-streaked face full of vulnerability. "Do you still want to fight for us, even after everything?" His answer was immediate, without hesitation. "I never stopped wanting to fight for us, and I'm not going anywhere now." Ava broke down again, and this time her tears felt different, less like grief and more like relief. Liam held her close, rocking her gently as the weight of their pain began to lift, little by little. But he knew this wasn't the end of their journey. There were still battles ahead, still moments of uncertainty. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel afraid. They would face it together, hand in hand. The thought of losing her had been unbearable. But now, standing in her arms, he realized something even more powerful. The thought of letting her face anything alone was even worse. Liam hesitated for a moment before finally opening the door. His heart raced as the cold night air brushed against his skin, but the person standing on the other side wasn't who he expected. Ava wasn't there. Instead, a delivery man in a dark jacket handed him a small envelope, nodded politely, and left without saying much. Liam stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of disappointment crashing down on him. He shut the door behind him and stared at the envelope, the world around him blurring as his mind scrambled with possibilities. It didn't have a return address, only his name written in Ava's familiar handwriting. His fingers trembled as he ripped it open, pulling out a neatly folded letter. The scent of her perfume clung faintly to the paper, triggering a surge of emotions that nearly overwhelmed him. As he unfolded the letter, his eyes locked on the first few words. "Liam, before you make up your mind about us, there's something you need to know." He could barely breathe as he continued reading. Her handwriting was neat, but there were smudges where the ink had bled, maybe from tears she had shed while writing it. "I know you probably hate me right now. You think I gave up on us, that I left because I couldn't handle the hard times. But that's not the truth. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was too afraid. I didn't want to see the pain in your eyes, and I didn't want you to see the fear in mine." Liam's grip tightened on the letter, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he read on. "I'm sick, Liam. I found out a few months ago, right around the time we started arguing more. At first, I thought it was just stress. I didn't want to worry you, so I kept it to myself. But when the doctor told me the truth, I didn't know how to face you. I didn't want you to be trapped in a life where you had to take care of me while watching me get worse." The room felt like it was spinning. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto the couch, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. His mind replayed every moment of the past few months, trying to reconcile her distance with the truth he was now holding. All the times she had come home late, the nights she had cried quietly in bed while she thought he was asleep. It all made sense now. She hadn't been running from him. She had been running from her own fear of what her illness would do to them. "I thought that pushing you away would be kinder than making you watch me fall apart. I thought that if you hated me, it would be easier for you to let me go. But now, sitting alone in this empty apartment, I realize I was wrong. I miss you, Liam. I miss us. And I know this is selfish to ask, but if there's any part of you that still loves me, I need you to come back." The last line of the letter broke him. "Please, don't let this be our ending." Tears streamed down Liam's face as he reread the letter over and over, unable to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. She hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She had left because she loved him too much to let him suffer. But in doing so, she had caused the very heartbreak she had tried to avoid. He wiped his face with his sleeve, the reality of her confession sinking in like a knife to the heart. He had wasted so much time being angry, blaming her for walking away, when all along she had been protecting him. His hands trembled as he folded the letter and pressed it against his chest. Memories of her smile, her laughter, and her gentle touch flooded his mind. He couldn't sit here any longer. Not now. Not when he knew the truth. Without wasting another second, Liam grabbed his coat and keys, heart pounding as he rushed out the door. Ava wasn't going to spend another night thinking she had to face this alone. Not if he could help it. Liam sat there, drowning in regret, staring at the spot near the door where Ava had once stood with her suitcase. The sound of the zipper being pulled shut still echoed in his head. Back then, he had convinced himself she just needed space, that this wasn't the end. But now, with the divorce papers signed and nothing left to hold on to, he realised how deeply he had misjudged everything. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to shake off the heaviness settling over him. But the weight only grew when he thought about the last few months before Ava left. The signs had been there, plain as day. He had just been too blind to see them. He remembered the way she had begun pulling away. She used to greet him with warm hugs when he walked through the door, but over time, those embraces became polite nods, her smile slowly fading into something distant and guarded. They used to stay up late talking about their dreams, but lately, those conversations had been replaced by awkward silences. And then, there were the phone calls. He remembered coming home late one night and seeing her sitting on the couch, phone in hand, whispering to someone. When she saw him, she had quickly ended the call and put the phone face down on the coffee table. Liam had brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just one of her friends or maybe her sister. But now, with the distance between them and the fear of losing her consuming him, his mind began spiraling. What if it wasn't a friend? What if she had been confiding in someone else, someone who gave her the attention he couldn't? The thought twisted his insides. He hated that he was even considering it, but it wouldn't leave him alone. The signs were all there. Her late nights, the secret phone calls, the way she started coming home hours after her usual time. It all pointed to something, didn't it? His stomach knotted as he thought about the worst-case scenario. What if Ava had fallen in love with someone else? Liam clenched his fists, trying to calm the storm in his mind. He knew he could confront her, but what was the point? She was already gone. The papers were signed. Besides, a part of him didn't want to hear the answer. What if she confirmed his worst fear? What if she told him there had been someone else, someone who understood her better than he did? He got up from the chair and paced around the room, each step echoing against the wooden floor. His gaze landed on the small vase of dying flowers on the kitchen counter, petals scattered like forgotten memories. Ava had always loved fresh flowers. She used to say they made the house feel alive. He had stopped buying them after she left, as if letting them wilt was symbolic of everything they had lost. Liam slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to his chest. He had spent the last few months torturing himself with questions that had no answers. What if he had come home early that night instead of staying late at the office? What if he had listened when she said she needed more of him? What if he had fought for their marriage instead of assuming she would always be there? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Mason. Liam ignored the call and stared at the screen until it dimmed, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. He didn't want to talk to Mason or anyone else. What could they say that he hadn't already told himself 100 times? He had messed up. He had taken Ava for granted, and now she was gone. Just as he was about to get up and head to bed, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the silence like a shockwave. Liam froze. His heart pounded as he stood there staring at the door, half hoping and half terrified of who might be on the other side. Could it be Ava? No, that was impossible. She had made it clear she didn't want anything to do with him anymore. But the possibility lingered, igniting a small flicker of hope. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the door, his palms sweating as he reached for the handle. Liam sat motionless, the photo still clutched in his hand, his mind replaying every moment that had led him here. The silence in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him as memories refused to let him go. He didn't want to think about the night Ava left, but his brain betrayed him, dragging him back to that final evening, the evening when everything unraveled. Ava had stood by the window, her back to him, watching the rain trickle down the glass. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as though she was shielding herself from something far more painful than the cold outside. Liam had walked into the room, exhausted from a long day at work, loosening his tie like it was any other evening. But this time, she didn't turn to greet him. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. "You're home late again," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam had sighed, tossing his briefcase onto the couch. "It's work, Ava. You know how demanding things have been." "I know," she said, still staring out the window. "I always know." Something about the way she said it struck him, but instead of probing deeper, he let the moment pass. He told himself it was just another small bump, another thing they could resolve later. But Ava had turned around, her eyes brimming with tears, and he finally realized how wrong he was. "Liam, I can't keep pretending," she had whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "I feel like I'm disappearing." He had been blindsided. "What do you mean? We're just going through a rough patch. Every couple does." Ava shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "No, Liam, this isn't a rough patch. This is me trying to hold on while you're slipping further away." He remembered standing there, frozen, unable to come up with the right words to comfort her. All he could say was, "I'm doing this for us. Everything I've been working on is for our future." "Our future?" Ava laughed bitterly. "What future, Liam? You don't even see me anymore." Her words had pierced him, but instead of acknowledging the truth in them, he had gotten defensive. "That's not fair, Ava. I've been doing my best. And maybe your best isn't what I need." Her voice broke at the end, and she wiped her tears quickly, as if trying to hide how much it hurt to say those words. "I wanted you, Liam. Not the man who comes home late every night and barely notices me. I didn't want the man who prioritizes meetings over our dinner dates." Liam had clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "You act like I don't care, like I'm not trying." Ava took a shaky breath and turned back toward the window. "I know you care, but it's too late. I can't be the woman who waits for someone who's already left her emotionally." The air between them had felt heavy, suffocating. He wanted to say something, to tell her that they could fix it, that he could change, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he had been wrong. Instead, he had stood there, silent, as she wiped away the last of her tears and walked toward the bedroom to pack her things. Now, as he sat at the table, the memory felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He wished he had chased after her, begged her to stay, or at least asked her what he could do to make things right. But he hadn't. He had watched her leave, and now he was paying the price for it. Liam sat at the dining table, the soft amber glow of the overhead light casting faint shadows across the room. His fingers trembled as he traced the stack of papers in front of him. Divorce papers. They felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. His name was already signed on the last page, a signature that felt more like a farewell than a formality. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Across the table sat an empty chair, the same chair where Ava once sat, with her morning coffee in hand and her eyes filled with dreams of a future they thought was unshakable. But that future had crumbled. The night Ava walked out still played vividly in his head. No yelling, no dramatic arguments, just the quiet sound of a suitcase being zipped. Liam had watched her from across the room, frozen in place, as she carried her bag to the door. Her lips quivered as if she had something left to say, but instead, she turned away and disappeared into the night. He hadn't stopped her. His pride kept him from calling out her name. At the time, he had convinced himself she would come back. But the days turned into weeks, and she never did. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, and buried his head in his hands. The memories hit him in waves of what they once had and what he had taken for granted. Weekend drives with no destination, the thrill of impromptu road trips, cooking breakfast together while dancing to old songs. Ava's laugh was infectious, the kind of sound that could brighten a room. And then there were the quiet nights on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched their favourite shows. He had believed moments like those would last forever, but forever was fleeting. He stared at his phone as it vibrated again. Another missed call from his best friend, Mason. Mason had been calling him regularly, trying to get him out of the house, trying to help him move on. But Liam wasn't ready to move on. How could he? His mind was trapped in a loop of what ifs. What if he had paid more attention? What if he had put down his phone during dinner instead of answering emails? What if he had just listened when Ava told him she was struggling instead of brushing it off as temporary stress? The last fight they had was still etched into his mind like a scar. It wasn't over something petty. Ava had told him she felt invisible. She said she needed more than just his financial support. She needed him. But Liam, blinded by his ambition and career, thought he had been doing enough. He thought being the provider was all she needed. He had been wrong. By the time he realised how deep her pain ran, she was already packing her things. He reached out, grabbing a framed picture from the table. Their wedding day. Ava was glowing in her lace dress, her eyes filled with love as she gazed at him. He had made promises that day, promises to cherish her, to always be her rock. But somewhere along the way, life happened, and he had forgotten the weight of those vows. His thumb brushed over the glass, lingering on her face. He could almost hear her laugh, could almost feel her fingers laced with his. The cold realization gripped him. He had let her slip away. A sudden gust of wind pushed the door slightly ajar, making Liam's heart skip a beat. For a brief, foolish moment, he hoped Ava was standing there, ready to walk back in and say she changed her mind. But the door didn't move again. The wind faded, and reality came crashing back. She wasn't coming back, or at least that's what he told himself as he stared down at the papers that symbolized the end of everything they had built.